I wish to thank the Chatham House for inviting me here to speak today. It is great to be back here, as I just said, in this globally acclaimed and globally renowned ideation house, where contemporary issues are debated and discussed. Ladies and gentlemen, my last time here was when I was campaigning for the presidency of the African Development Bank Group in 2015. A lot has happened since then. I was elected in 2015, otherwise I wouldn't have been introduced as president of the African Development Bank, and re-elected for the second term in 2020 with 100% votes of all the 81 shareholder countries. Thank you, African and non-African. It is equally auspicious that I'm also speaking to you today, few days after the annual meetings of the African Development Bank Group that we held in very beautiful city of Nairobi, Kenya. There, our shareholders unanimously approved an additional $117 billion increase in the capital of the African Development Bank Group. This follows an earlier general capital increase of the bank, which raised the capital of the bank from $93 billion, where I met it when I came, to $201 billion in 2019. This new capital injection last week brings the capital of the bank to $318 billion. So you can understand that in the context of changing global financial architecture that we've been asked to do, we're going to be bigger, bolder, and better. The historic increase in the financial capacity shows the confidence of our shareholders in African Development Bank's vision for Africa and our resolve and commitment to accelerate its growth and development, I must add, relentlessly. They did so because our high fives, which are the priorities of the bank, to light up and power Africa. You all know about that, I guess, to feed Africa, to integrate Africa, to industrialize Africa, and to improve the quality of life of the people of Africa. That's what we call the high fives at the African Development Bank. They have impacted on over 400 million people in the last 8 years. This newly injected capital will allow us to do more. It is therefore with great excitement of the wind in the sails of the African Development Bank that I am delighted to speak to you today on envisioning Africa's economic prospects. Ladies and gentlemen, the New York Times recently had as its headlines, "The future is African." I agree, of course, with the New York Times. Africa can no longer be ignored. I fully expect Africa to be the pivotal continent in the world, given its economic prospects. First, Africa's population is projected to reach 2.5 billion by 2050. And by then, 1 in every 4 persons on Earth will be African. With rising middle class and projected consumer and, of course, business expenditures projected to reach over $7 trillion, this is a formidable market of the future you cannot ignore. Second, with its burgeoning youth population of almost 1 billion people under the age of 35, Africa will boom with talented skills and form the workforce of the world. Third, with 65% of the uncultivated arable land left to feed 9.5 billion people in the world, it's not in Asia, it's not Latin America, it's not in Europe, it's not in China, it's in Africa. So what Africa does with agriculture is going to absolutely determine the future of food in the world. Fourth, the future of energy transition for a world powered largely with renewable energy will actually depend on Africa, because Africa has the largest solar potential in the world, which of course will be critical for developing green hydrogen and green ammonia that will power economies of the world towards net zero emissions. Africa also has the largest deposits of green metals, minerals, from platinum to copper, nickel, manganese, chromium, graphite, and lithium, which of course are all critical for manufacturing of solar panels, battery energy storage systems, and electric vehicles. And the value of those electric vehicles by 2025 will be $7 trillion. By 2050, it will be worth $57 trillion. Fifth, the African Continental Free Trade Area, which of course brings together all 54 African countries, with an estimated GDP of $3.4 trillion, is on its way to becoming, actually, the largest free trade zone in the world in terms of number of participating countries. Therefore, ladies and gentlemen, economic trends, growth and development of Africa are central as we look to a world where the continent will play a very significant role. Ladies and gentlemen, despite challenges of COVID-19 pandemic, geopolitical risks, high food and energy prices, and the rising global interest rates, African countries are showing economic resilience. Africa's real GDP growth rate increased from 3.1% in 2022 to 3.7% in 2023 and to 4.3% projected for 2025, according to a report of the African Economic Outlook that we released last week at our annual meetings of the African Development Bank. Africa is the second fastest growing region in the world, second only to Asia, and has actually 10 out of the 20 fastest growing countries in the world. As Africa's economic resilience is bolstered, unlocking its economic prospects that we're talking about requires ensuring structural change of its economies, raising the productivity of agriculture, so we're always back to agriculture, provision of electricity, accelerating infrastructure investments, and supporting fast-paced digitalization, unleashing economic and job opportunities for women and youth, and driving industrialization through greater mobilization of the private sector. Assuring food security in Africa is top on the agenda for the African Development Bank. Of course, as you know, I'm an agricultural economist and the first one ever to have come from an agricultural background to lead a global multilateral development bank. So, you know, agriculture is it at the front of the agenda. It's in my genes. Over the past 8 years, we have provided close to $10 billion in support of our flagship initiatives in agriculture. One of our top flagship initiatives is called Technologies for African Agricultural Transformation. In other words, it's called TAAT. It has delivered climate-smart agricultural technologies for over 13 million farmers. And one of the ones is in Ethiopia. And when I spoke with Prime Minister of Ethiopia, Abiy at the time, I told them that we got the technologies that can allow Ethiopia to become entirely self-sufficient in wheat. And it's called heat-tolerant wheat varieties. We gave it to them, 65,000 metric tons we gave to them. Now, if you want to understand what 65,000 metric tons is, think of an A380 aircraft. In terms of the passengers you have, in terms of the cargo load you have on the fuel, that's essentially 94.3 tons, that's it. So when I say 65,000 metric tons of seed, think of that as like having 665 A380 aircraft, Airbuses on a landing strip. That's how much, that's in terms of volume of seed. They started and they grew it on 5,000 hectares in 2018. Last year, they grew it on 2.2 million hectares. In less than 4 years, Ethiopia became 100% self-sufficient in wheat. That's a record. And so if you can do that in Ethiopia, there's no doubt in my mind that we can do it absolutely everywhere. The African Development Bank is also developing what I call special agro-industrial processing zones. We're doing those in 11 countries to support agro-industrialization and value addition and the development of agricultural value chains. You see, the size of the food and agricultural market in Africa is going to reach $1 trillion by 2030. And Africa cannot and should not continue to export primary commodities. The door to poverty is the export of primary commodities. The highway to wealth is value addition. Therefore, whether it's cocoa, whether it's coffee, whether it's tea, whatever it is that we have, We've got to not be at the bottom of that value chain. We must be at the top of that value chain. And that is why, without consolidated infrastructure that will drive structural transformation of agriculture, that's not going to happen. That's why we are investing heavily in these special agro-industrial processing zones to unlock that value for us. And of course, unlocking Africa's renewable energy resources and assuring energy supply, access, and security is fundamental for Africa's economic prosperity. As I speak to you today, still close to 600 million Africans don't have access to electricity. But that's good news because we kept working at it. Since I was elected president, I put electricity front and center of everything we're going to do. Because you cannot industrialize in the dark. You cannot be competitive in the dark. You cannot be a global powerhouse if you don't have electricity. And so we launched what's called the New Deal on Energy in 2016. Much progress has been made. The percentage of the population that have access to electricity used to be 32% when we started. Now it's 57%. Significant progress has been made. But we need to turn the power of the light. God loves Africa so much. We got so much sunshine. In fact, when I came here, I was just coming from Goldman Sachs, and they were telling me that I brought a lot of sunshine. And I said, well, look, we can turn and sunlight into a tradable commodity and sell it literally around the world. To do that, if you look at the Sahel has the highest solar irradiation in the world. And yet, it doesn't have electricity. It doesn't make any sense. And therefore, at the African Development Bank, we launched a big program, a $20 billion program that's called Desert to Power. That Desert to Power is to take the entire 11 countries that share the Sahelian zone all across Africa and produce and develop 10,000 megawatts of solar power energy systems that will provide electricity for 250 million people. And so it's ongoing, and we can talk about that in the Q&A sections. If anybody wants to ask questions, it's not something we're planning to do. It's something that we have started. And when it is done, it will be the largest solar zone in the entire world. Now, during the spring meetings of the World Bank earlier this year, my dear friend and colleague Ajay Banga, president of the World Bank Group, and I launched a bold effort to connect 300 million Africans to electricity by 2030, jointly between the World Bank and the African Development Bank. In fact, this came out because when Ajay was running for president of the bank, he came to see me. He said, look, you are the first person I came to see in the world. I left Washington as soon as I was elected, and I came straight to see you. And he asked me, what do you have in mind? I said, look, only 3 things. I'm not going to ask you for more than 3 things. First, you work together with us to make sure Africa has 100% electricity. Second, you work with us to make sure Africa feeds itself and unlocks its agricultural potential, because that's going to give us really equitable economic growth with millions of people out of poverty. And third, work with us to make sure that our young people have skills, entrepreneurship, and also the jobs that they need to thrive on our continent. So the first thing that and Ajay is probably going to be listening to me, so he knows that this is just the first one. My second one is coming, and the third one is coming, but he's a great guy. So we launched that, and we're working on it to be able to deliver it. And by the way, we're going to have an energy summit this year that will actually drive that agenda all across Africa. It's phenomenal. We've never seen that before. And that's a different way in which we work now today as global financial institutions. Ladies and gentlemen, the African Development Bank is investing heavily in human capital to unlock and to unleash the growth potential of Africa, tapping into the enormous potential that we have in the diaspora. See, many Africans here that are in the diaspora, right? So it's brain circulation that we have, right? Global expertise, but made available to Africa and tapped for Africa's benefit. And we are working today supporting universities of science and technology, expanding training in science, in technology, in engineering, in mathematics, and centers of excellence in biotechnology, in material sciences, in artificial intelligence, as well as technical and vocational training that will spur knowledge-based economies from Africa. We have actually committed $700 million to education and skills development, which has supported over 4,000 tertiary education and training centers, provided 1.7 million African youth with access to education in science, in technologies, in engineering, and of course in mathematics, which are fundamental to driving a global knowledge economy. The African Development Bank is supporting what we call coding for employment programs. The future of the world is about coding. That's the new currency in the world. And with our population, we want to be playing in that particular market to provide digital skills in supporting computer coding in partnership with Microsoft philanthropies. This is essential to drive the expansion of the rapidly expanding fintech industries in Africa. And as you know, Africa has witnessed a tripling of the number of startups that we have, reaching 5,200 between 2020 and 2021. The revenue of Africa's fintech companies has exploded to over $30 billion projected by 2025. Now that trend, in terms of the size of the digital economy, was estimated by Google and also by IFC, the International Finance Corporation, to reach $180 billion by 2025, just next year. And by 2050, it will reach $712 billion. So unleashing the potential of that digital economy will require large-scale investments in digital infrastructure, including fiber optics, data centers, and the expansion of mobile networks to improve connectivity. Now, when I was elected president of the bank, one of the first places I went to was a place in Senegal called the Gorée Island. I wanted to feel that to be a moral compass for me as I started my summit. I went over there, and of course, for those of you that probably have gone to Gorée Island, you go right through it, and there's a door that they say is a door of no return. And I stood there, and I had a lot of things, memories, and all kind of things. It was a pretty emotional time for me. And as I stood there, I saw in my vision that this is why the best and the brightest and the strongest of Africa were. And they were taken out and put in on boats on the Mediterranean, and they were shipped outside of Africa. Went back into my car with all of the emotion running right through me and my thoughts and so on. And I sat down and I said to myself, but look, today, then they did it against their own volition. Today, on their own volition, several of Africa's youth are taking the same kind of boats. They're just not locked up this way, but people sitting at the bottom of boats trying to flee from a continent. So I knew that a big agenda for us has to be how to tap and unleash the potential of our youth. It's all about pride. I was with Prime Minister Meloni of Italy at the Italy-Africa Summit, and she's good, she's doing a great job, and we had a great conversation. And I said, well, look, the issue of dealing with Africa's youth migration, the future of Africa's youth is not in London. It's not in America. It's not in Asia. It's not in Latin America. It's not in any parts of the world. It is in Africa, growing well, with quality growth, paying attention to inequality, and paying attention to turn its demographic asset into an economic dividend. The young people of Africa are the best assets we have, but we have to put our money to back them up, to take on the world, and they can do that. And that's why the African Development Bank, when I got in there, I said, look, we're going to create what we call new financial institutions around our young people. And we are doing that today because we have rolled out, or we are rolling out, what's called Youth Entrepreneurship Investment Banks. They are new financial institutions whose whole focus, take the skills, take the entrepreneurship, take the brain power of our young people, help them to turn into great businesses, and put the wind of financial capital behind them. They are not different from anybody around the world. Take a risk for them. And so we got 2 of those already approved by our board, and several of them are on the way. We had for Liberia $16 million, Ethiopia $32 million, with several more, as I said, in the pipeline. And Vice President Solomon Quenyo is right here, and he's my Vice President in charge of that operation. We are also focusing on women. Women run Africa, actually, let me tell you that. And that's not just a cliche. I'll tell you, when I was chief economist for the West Africa Rice Development Association in the 1990s, I traveled to Nigeria. When I got to Nigeria, I was flying back to Abidjan. And I got in those days into one aircraft. They used to call them Air Afrique. You remember? We used to have an aircraft called Air Afrique. And as I got in there, I saw so many women carrying baskets on their head with a lot of clothing, all kind of wrappers and stuff in it. And I had just a small computer with me and a compact. You know, remember those compacts that's like a suitcase, like you grab them like that. And I was looking for where to find a space to put it. And the hostess looked at me after I was struggling and said, "Can I help you, sir?" I said, "Yes, I'm looking for a place because all these women, market women, taking over all the space with baskets and all of that." And she said, "How many times do you fly this aircraft?" I said, "It depends on how my job takes me." She said, "You know, these women, they may look not like they don't have a lot of money, but they own this aircraft." "Oh, really?" "Yes." Well, you know, I traveled all the way from Korea for this, so you're going to have to give me time. You know, and they took it, my thing, she said, "I'll put it up for you in the, up there, make way for the women." And I never forgot that. And so at the African Development Bank, we have what we call AFAWA, Affirmative Finance Action for Women, to mobilize $5 billion of financing in support of women businesses in Africa. And we are making headways with it. Already, we are working with 169 financial institutions in 43 countries. We've approved $1.7 billion of financing for more than 18,300 businesses or women. As I said, we are well on our target to raising the $5 billion. Ladies and gentlemen, let me also now talk about improving regional integration. To assure the success of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, we provided more than $50 billion in support of infrastructure in the last 8 years. That includes infrastructure for ports, for rails, for digital infrastructure, for water, for sanitation and digital infrastructure. We also launched a new effort called Alliance for Green Infrastructure in Africa, which is to mobilize $10 billion to build green infrastructure all across Africa, because we're just getting most of our infrastructure done, and we want it to be green. And Minister Amadou Hott, former Minister of Economy of Senegal, is my special envoy doing that. We are mobilizing private sector investments in Africa. We supported a $24 billion LNG project in Mozambique, which will provide $66 billion of revenue for Mozambique and make it the third largest exporter of LNG in the world. We've supported Aliko Dangote's refinery, $19.5 billion refinery, which is the largest single-train refinery in the world, and also ammonia plant. OCP in Morocco, it's the largest phosphate company in the world, and we are also supporting that. But as we do all that, ladies and gentlemen, we realize that for private sector investment, the key is risk, especially market risk, counterparty risk, exchange risks, and political risk. To mitigate this, we are deploying a whole series of instruments, from partial credit guarantees to partial risk guarantees, to support them. And just a few cases, we did this already in Benin, where we did $195 million of partial credit guarantees to help them raise $350 million from international banks and institutional investors. And two critical things: it lengthened the maturity of their issues, and it also reduced the interest rate by more than 290 basis points below what they would have actually gotten if they actually went on their own. We've done the same also for Egypt, to allow them to raise a $500 million Panda bond, the first ever by an African sovereign on the China capital markets, which won one of the deals of the year. We are also now, if you look at Tanzania, DRC, and Burundi, they have a $3.5 billion railway project that we are using partial credit guarantees to mobilize all the capital to help make that happen. But as we talk about that, you know the issue is exchange risk. And that happens because in Africa you have currency-denominated loans in foreign currency, but you're getting a lot of your counterparties' revenues in local currency. And therefore, we are deploying a whole slew of instruments to deal with that local currency products. And that includes local currency loans, the use of private sector FX hedging institutions, such as TCX, for example. Now, as I go around, I'm asked a lot of questions about the issue of risk in Africa. Look, I'm not denying that there are risks, but Africa is no more riskier than any part of the world. But don't believe, a lot of it is perception. Well, perception is not reality, and I'll tell you why. You know, Moody's Analytics did an assessment, 14-year assessment of the cumulative losses on infrastructure around the world. Guess what they found? They found that losses in Africa was 1.9%. In North America, it was 6.6%. In Latin America, it was 10%. In Eastern Europe, it was over 12%. In Western Asia, 4.6%. Now you tell me. Perception is not reality. And that's why we are working today, and I understand there are risks, so don't get me wrong, but I'm just saying we are now more riskier than any other part of the world. And that's why I'm glad to be in UK today. You know, your minister, Minister Mitchell, is a fantastic minister for you at FCDO. We've got $2 billion guaranteed from the FCDO to free up $2 billion for climate finance. We've got another $1 billion freed up by guarantee from the FCDO to allow us to put $1 billion in supporting South Africa's just energy transition. And for those of you that have been to the Africa Investment Forum, which we brought together investors to Africa, in the last 5 years that we've done it, we've mobilized well over $180 billion of investment interest to Africa. Does that sound to you like a continent that doesn't have a lot of opportunities? No. It tells you the opportunities are limitless. We just have to manage the risk. When I go around, people say, well, Africa has risk. I say, my job is not to market Africa's risks or Africa's challenges. My job is to market Africa's opportunities and manage its risks. It's a risk-return world, and Africa is no different. Now, let me say that as we look at the economic prospects, they are strong. But as I close, I want to say they will require overcoming some significant headwinds. One of it is climate change. Climate change is buffeting Africa. We lose $7 to $50 billion a year from climate change. That will rise to roughly $50 billion by 2030. But we get only 3% in terms of climate finance. We get $30 billion. The need is $277 billion. But we at the bank, we are doing more about that for ourselves. When I was elected president, we put in 9% of all of our financing into climate. Today, we are putting 55% of all our financing into climate. And we also have launched what is called the Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program, or AAAP. It's the largest adaptation program in the world. It's $25 billion with the Global Center on Adaptation. The second headwind is debt. We have, of course, 22 countries at high risk of debt distress. And this is because concessional financing has declined globally. And this year, debt service payments by African countries will be $74 billion. And that is up from $17 billion in 2010. So, ladies and gentlemen, as we are passionate about the vision and the potential of Africa, we have to do the following to be able to make sure Africa gets the resources to achieve that target. Action is needed in 5 areas. First, the G20 Common Framework, which is the bilateral and multilateral pact to do this, must work faster for Africa. We can't afford to have a lost decade like we had during the multilateral debt relief initiative or the issue we had in the 1990s. Second, the global financial architecture needs to deliver greater concessional financing for Africa. And we have a tool for that. That's called African Development Fund. We are going to be going for our 17th replenishment of that fund. IDA of the World Bank is on its 24th replenishment of that. We want to make sure that we get more of concessional financing, so countries are not going to the capital markets at very high rate, commercial rate, to do development. You can't do development at commercial rate. Third, we have to make sure that the global financing system delivers more for Africa and avoid economic divergences that are coming about because of slow economic recovery of Africa from COVID. COVID went away, yes. People have long COVID, but we had long fiscal COVID in Africa today. And therefore, if you take a look at how much capital financing was given to deal with COVID by developed countries, $19 trillion it was. 19% of the global GDP. Africa, $83 billion, 4.5% of its global GDP. So there's a lot of inequity in how these things are done. Also, take a look at its special drawing rights, which were issued by the IMF. There are contingent facilities to deal with global shocks. $650 billion were issued. Africa, guess what? Got $33 billion. That's 4.5% for a population of about 1.2 billion, 1.3 billion people. And so, but I'm delighted, however, that the African Development Bank, working with the Inter-American Development Bank, we came up with a structure that can allow those SDRs to be used better and leveraged. And it was approved by the IMF Board of Directors after 2 years of hard work and advocacy. And here is what that means. Because we are AAA rated financial institutions, $1 of SDR would turn to $4 because we are AAA rated financial institution. So when IMF approved it for $20 billion up to for hybrid capital, that means that we can leverage that to deliver $80 billion of financing all across African countries and other regions. I also want to say, finally, that it has to do with how African sovereigns and non-sovereign are rated. We are not rated fairly. We are not rated fairly. If Africa's ratings are actually done fairly, the United Nations Development Program says that Africa would save $75 billion a year in interest service payments. So, and that's why, for us, we take this issue very seriously, and we are working with Africa to set up an Africa credit rating agency. It's not to replace global rating agencies. No, don't get me wrong. If you go to a doctor, here's your scan, you must also be able to get a second opinion. And so that's very important that the risks are well understood. President Ruto said last week, he said he had to pay 200 basis points higher just because there was a coup in Niger Republic. And he had to tell the rating agency, I don't know the particular one, that last time he checked the map of Kenya, Niger was not inside of the map. So as I close, Africa's trajectory will be stronger as we tackle these challenges, but we must improve security. Security is a big issue that we must do, and deliver more concessional financing. At the end of the day, what will make the most difference is mobilization of domestic resources. It will require strong macroeconomic and fiscal management, expanding tax resources, tax revenues, reducing corruption and illicit capital flows, improving fiscal management, financial management, and unlocking the huge potential of our natural capital assets, which is more than $6.8 trillion. Ladies and gentlemen, the Africa we want is within reach. We can see it. It's within reach. We are making good progress, and we're in the right direction. With strong political will, and maybe stronger political will, global partnerships and regional cooperation, Africa will emerge as the pivotal continent. An Africa critical for the future of the world. An Africa thriving, peaceful, and prosperous. It's a vision Africa deserves. It's a vision we must do all to achieve. Thank you very much. No, thank you all very much for the questions. Let me start with the issue of Burkina Faso and Niger on the issue of security. If anybody wakes me up and say, Akin, Adesina, what worries you the most? I'll tell you what worries me the most is insecurity. And the insecurity in Africa is not the standard insecurity that comes from nations fighting each other, although we have one or two cases, like outliers, that happens. It's insecurity that is within. It's coming out of inequality. It's coming out of climate change. It's coming out of the fact that you have massive areas of land that have been just degraded. You take, for example, in Nigeria, Governor Fahimi is here, used to be minister in Nigeria. The whole area around Lake Chad Basin used to be 25,000 kilometers. Today it's 2,500. With that shrank all the economy opportunities for people. And so we have to realize that it's not your standard thing that you can fight with guns and all of that, although sometimes you have to do that. But the real fight we must do is a fight against inequality. It's a fight against poverty. It's a fight against rural areas which have become zones of economic misery today. And turn those zones of economic misery into zones of economic prosperity. You got 70% of our people there. And so we must have a different fight. It's not a military fight. It's an economic policy fight that recognizes that we cannot continue to leave 70% of our population behind and hope to develop without any schisms. That can happen. So I think, how are we dealing with that fragility, as you said? First is that we have at the African Development Bank what we call a transition support facility. That transition support facility supported Cote d'Ivoire when it was in conflict to become what it is today. It went from, a country in disaster. We left Cote d'Ivoire 11 years. We went to Tunisia. And they became the first country, because of that facility, to graduate from a fragile situation into the window of the African Development Bank. That tells you the power of that particular vehicle. The second is, I was talking about the issue of risk. No part of the world can ever develop without private sector. It's impossible. It's not just business of government. But often when it comes to these areas, like you say, Burkina Faso, Mali, and all of that, people just kind of feel that, oh, well, it's very difficult places there. We have something called the private sector facility at the African Development Bank, which allows us to lend to private sector in those areas that people run away from. I was in a meeting recently, and I won't say why, a place, so that nobody can actually track me and say, this is where I found it from. But we were having a big discussion globally, and somebody said, well, we want to do this, but not in, not in Somalia or not in Sudan. And I say, hey, excuse me, please. I'm around. I'm president of the African Development Bank. We are going to do it there. We understand the risk. We have been lending from the private sector facility to Mali, to Burkina Faso, to Chad, to Niger. We have not had a single non-performing loan in those areas. If you know your neighborhood, you don't have to be scared. And we know that neighborhood very well. So we have a facility that allows us to do risk lending in those particular places. Talking of insecurity, however, I accept that in those countries, their expenditures on security is going this way. Expenditures on development is going the other direction. So we have a problem. So the issue is, if you can't keep peace, if you're going to have security, how are you going to have development? But there is something fundamental that we must change in global development thinking. That it's not United Nations Security Council that should be handling the issue of security. As I said, it's a different kind of security that we have today. What we actually need is new vehicles that allow us to connect or realize that security is not an exogenous issue to the development process. It's an endogenous issue to the development process. And therefore, we must have a good link between security, between investment, between growth and development. That whole thing, it's a new thing that we must develop. And those of us that are global financial institutions must ask ourselves the question, what kind of tools must we change? 80% of Africans today are either living in a place where there is insecurity or close to somewhere where there is insecurity. And so it's like, how do you do that without having the financing vehicles that support people, countries? And that's why at the African Development Bank, I made a presentation to the African heads of state, and they agreed. And we are developing today what's called security index investment bonds. New financial products that will allow us to raise long-term money on the capital markets to support Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, Chad, all the countries that have been having insecurity, to do four things. We don't go into guns, we don't go into ammunition, we don't do anything like that, but rebuild damaged infrastructure. Roads, water, sanitation, education facilities, health facilities. If those things are not there, you don't have social capital in the communities. And when terrorists come, they just find an empty field, people against government, and it's very easy for them to recruit them. And that's what happened. You saw that in Mozambique when they invaded all that. You saw that in many parts. You see that also, even in Nigeria, my own country. You see it in the north. You see it in the Sahel. You see it everywhere. So we need these new vehicles to be able to do that. As I said earlier, focusing investments in the urban area has been what everybody's been doing. You got 70% of your population in rural areas. Who speaks for them? We've got to really change that completely. Secondly, when financing is provided for nations, it focuses on the sovereign. The people don't live just in the sovereign. They actually live right in the states, in the communities, in the municipalities. Who's giving money to the mayors? Who's giving money to the local government services? Who is supporting them? And we concentrate everything at the top. And that's why when we say change the global financial architecture, it should be more than that. Change the global financial architecture, but change the pipeline. The pipes that go, it must go to where the people are. A principle of subsidiarity means that you get financing close to where the people are. And therefore, for us, or for me at the African Development Bank, I believe that we need, if we're going to deal with inequality, make sure we support the mayors, the subnationals, build their fiduciary capacity, help them to be able to have a good credit rating, to be able to raise municipal bonds, to be able to do a lot of things. Governor here, Governor Fayemi, is here, was the governor of Ekiti State. When I went over there, we had an hospital that we were supporting there. And we left that hospital, great hospital, and I called him, right? I said, Mr. Governor, I just left this hospital, great hospital, but the road is terrible. He said to me, fortunately, the road is not mine. The road belongs to the federal government. And I asked, the people in the state will be blaming him for what he's not responsible for. Who cares about whether it belongs to the federal government or it belongs to the state? Just do it. And so he worked very hard to make sure that's done. But I'm just telling you the kind of challenges that those who run things at the bottom have when we don't have a vehicle that lends to them directly. So we have to change that if we are going to deal with inequality issues. Of course, we can't do that without also having financing vehicles that support low-income countries. Most times that we discuss, we talk about middle-income countries. Well, the world is more than that. You've got 37 countries that are low-income countries in Africa. Niger, Mali, Chad, Burkina Faso, Mauritania, all these low-income countries, Somalia, Sudan. But they depend on the African Development Fund, which is the concessional financing vehicle of the bank. That's why I'm making the case that we need to raise significantly the volume of concessional financing for the low-income countries. They're the most vulnerable. Think of climate change, for example. I was the president of BIO of Sierra Leone in Paris when we were at the Clean Cooking Summit in Paris. And he said to me, well, like Adesina, in my country, we lose a bridge. It takes us so much money to build the bridge. Climate change comes, it wipes it out. It's going to take us forever to find the money to rebuild the bridge. And so we need to make sure we are providing vehicles, financing vehicles to support the building of resilience for these most vulnerable countries. 9 out of the 10 most vulnerable countries to climate change are in Africa. All of them depend on African Development Fund. So if you're here, and I'm trying to make a pitch, that you help us to make your voice loud and clear that we need at least $25 billion to be raised for the African Development Fund replenishment. We have minerals, oil, gas, metals. But those, when we negotiate, we have an asymmetric negotiation in which those that you are negotiating with have more tax lawyers than your entire country. And therefore, the negotiation it's not in your favor. And so people take their pen and sign into things that are not necessarily in the interest of their own people, because just the judges don't know, right? And that's why we have something at the bank, at the African Development Bank, called Africa Legal Support Facility. It brings together some of the topmost lawyers, and it's done gratuitely, free, for countries to negotiate and renegotiate terms and conditions of what they have done before, in terms of the issue with whether it's royalties or whether it's taxes. You know, I tell you, I will not name the country. We have one country to renegotiate its obligation to another third country based on those things, down by 94%. So knowledge matters, capacity matters. We have to build capacity you're right, to be able to intelligently and effectively negotiate. You talked about the issue of value addition. I'll give an example of Guinea, Guinea-Conakry. We have Guinea-Conakry, they have a lot of bauxite. But if you are exporting bauxite, why are you exporting bauxite? Why can't you do aluminum? You're going to be poor if you keep doing that. So we supported them to have rail in the bokeh mines and all of that, but to build their capacity to be able to do it into aluminum. The same thing, I went to Mauritania. I got there, they have iron ore, they're exporting iron ore. They do about $1.5 billion of export through SNIM, which is their local, the company there. And when I got over there, I said, well, why are you exporting just iron ore? We don't have power. I said, we don't have power. You just have gas. Well, sorry, the shell that actually had the gas thing, you do it in such a way that all the gas will be exported. I said, well, why is that? You need to have a situation where the principle of eminent domain dominates. The part of the natural resources you have must be dedicated to your own national interests. And that you run it to have power, to turn your iron ore to higher value products, steel and all of that, and be exporting that. So we have to change our mindset. Last one on green metals that you said. Yes, you know, whether it's platinum, gold, you know, lithium, chromium, whatever, we have all that. But we must not make the same mistake where we are exporting this to others. There is a concentration of supply chains in the world about the green metals, about whether it's solar panels, whether it's battery energy storage systems, but they all depend on Africa for the natural resources for that. Question is, why can't we build, and we must build, value chains in Africa to add value to those things? And that's why we have now supported a green metal strategy for Africa, working with other financial institutions and the African Union. Take, for example, your ambassador, lithium-ion precursor battery, 10,000 tons capacity. If you were doing that in DRC Congo, it's 3 times less expensive than doing that in China, or in Poland, or in the United States. So it is better, therefore, to develop those value chains. But to do it, you need infrastructure. You need power. Those things consume a lot of power. And so it comes back to the issue of power, infrastructure to be cost competitive in trying to do that. And I would say, at the end of the day, transparency over natural resources matters. We cannot be poor in natural resources, given what we have. The value is about $6.8 trillion. Manage it well, manage it transparently, build the value chains, and Africa will be rich from it. About agriculture, yes, you know, what's that one thing that we need to do? It's turning, nobody eats potential, yeah? There's no market for it. We have 65% of the arable land left in the world, but there's no market for that. You've got to turn that potential into real thing. And that's why I was telling you about what we've done with Ethiopia and several other countries. Just last year, January, I held an Feed Africa Summit together with the president of Senegal, President Macky Sall, a fantastic president. You know, and I went to see the new president, who's also a fantastic president, and so. Well, thank you. Yeah. But in any case, we had 34 heads of state and government that came and attended this event. And what happened was the first time that had ever happened. The heads of state were in the room, and they were looking me straight in the eye and telling me, President Ruto told me, and President Masisi of Zambia. Sorry, Hichilema of Zambia. And he said, we actually feel that you are being too generous to us. Because We ought to be ashamed about the situation, that we can't feed ourselves. Why? You know, others are going to the moon. Why are we just trying to feed ourselves, right? And so the fact I'm trying to say is that it was a great summit. We were able to develop what's called food and agricultural delivery compacts for every country in Africa. That gives you a roadmap of how every country should be self-sufficient in food in 5 years. We're not going to be trying to feed ourselves forever while everybody's landing on the moon. And so we have been able to mobilize $70 billion to implement those food and agricultural development compacts around the world. It's never happened in Africa's history. That's because there's political will to get that down. So if there's one thing that allowed Asia to feed itself, it was political will. It was one thing that allowed America or even the UK to feed itself, it was political will. Because there is no dignity in begging for food. You have to have it in yourself and develop with pride. And that's what I think is most important. If you have that, you are going to be able to do it.